I'm 28 years old. The moment my grandmother looked me dead in the eye and said I'd never amount to anything. It was during a family reunion. The kind where everyone pretends to be happy, but you can feel the tensions simmering under every forced smile. I was standing near the fireplace, holding a glass of cheap wine, when her voice cut through the chatter like a knife, cold, sharp, and meant to wound. The room went silent, every single relative turning to look at me, and I felt this tight knot climb up my throat, choking back words I desperately wanted to scream. If this story is hitting close to home, hit that subscribe button and drop a like. You're going to want to see how this unfolds. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. That sentence, those 5 brutal words, became the soundtrack to my entire life, playing on repeat every time I tried to prove I was worth something, me and the disappointment. But instead, it became the moment that shattered whatever fragile hope I'd been clinging to. I walked out of that house that night feeling like I'd been stripped bare in front of everyone I knew, exposed as the failure my grandmother always believed I was. What I didn't know then, what none of them could have predicted, was that, years later, everything would flip in the most unexpected way imaginable. And when an inheritance landed in my lap from someone who actually saw my worth, it wasn't just money that changed hands. It was validation, justice, and the sweetest kind of closure. But I'm going to tell you every single detail. Growing up, as the disappointment wasn't something that happened overnight, it was a slow, agonizing process that shaped every part of who I became. From the time I was a kid, my grandmother, Margaret, made it crystal clear that I wasn't her favorite, not even close. Jacob and Claire were the golden children, the ones who could do no wrong, the ones whose report cards got framed and whose mistakes got brushed under the rug. Meanwhile, every little thing I did was scrutinized, criticized, or just flat out ignored. It wasn't dramatic or explosive, it was quiet, insidious. The kind of rejection that seeps into your bones until you start believing you really are less than everyone else. Which the family reunion wasn't just a random get-together, it was the culmination of decades of wounds that never healed, resentments that festered in silence, and a toxic dynamic that everyone pretended didn't exist. Just maybe, things would be different this time, that someone would acknowledge the progress I'd made, the life I was trying to build. I felt it, the same old judgment, the sideways glances, the whispered comparisons, and when my grandmother delivered that final blow, it was like she'd ripped open every scar I'd been trying to heal and poured salt directly into the wound. See, that forces you to see things as they really are. How much I sacrificed, or how desperately I tried to earn their approval. It would never be enough because they'd already decided who I was, and nothing I did would change that narrative. So I made a choice that night, one that would alter the trajectory of my entire life. I stopped trying to prove my worth to people who refused to see it. And that decision, painful as it was, opened the door to something I never expected: real freedom, real growth, and eventually, a vindication so powerful it would leave them all speechless. I was 7 years old the first time I realized my grandmother didn't love me the way she loved my cousin. And honestly, that realization hits differently when you're just a kid trying to figure out where you belong. It was Christmas morning. When I opened mine, it was a pair of socks, plain white ones from the dollar store, still in the plastic packaging. Everyone saw it. The difference was impossible to miss. But nobody said a word. They just exchanged those awkward glances adults make when they know something's wrong but refuse to acknowledge it. At least in my family, wasn't distributed equally, and some of us were always going to get the short end of the stick. Like watching the same movie play out over and over with slightly different scenes, but always the same ending. Emily got straight A's. Grandma threw her a party and invited half the neighborhood over. Jacob made the soccer team, cheering louder than anyone else. Claire painted a picture in art class. But when I won second place in the school spelling bee, worked my tail off for weeks to get there, all I got was a half-hearted, "That's nice, dear," and a reminder that Emily had won first place when she was my age. Every achievement I earned was measured against someone else's success, and I always came up short, not because I wasn't good enough. It was the act of erasure, literally delete me from the narrative of our family. Before I continue, make sure you're subscribed because what happens next is absolutely insane, and leave a like if you're as shocked as I was. She'd tell stories at dinner parties about her grandchildren's, listing off Emily's college acceptance, Jacob's promotion, Claire's engagement, and then she'd just stop, as if I didn't exist at all. When relatives asked about me, she'd wave her hand dismissively and change the subject. Or worse, she'd say something like, "Oh, Nora's still figuring things out," in that tone that made it clear she believed I never would. That relentless message that I was the defective one, the disappointment, the one who didn't measure up, planted seeds of doubt so deep that even decades later, I still catch myself wondering if maybe she was right. By the time I hit high school, I was absolutely desperate to prove I was worth something, anything, and that desperation turned me into a people pleaser on steroids. I took on every extra shift at my part-time job, volunteered for every committee at school, stayed up until 2 in the morning finishing homework because I thought if I just worked hard enough, eventually someone would notice. My grades were solid, not perfect like Emily's, but good enough to make honor roll 3 years running. Without being asked, babysat my younger brother Connor for free every weekend, and never once complained about the hand-meeting clothes or the fact that my birthday dinner was usually just take-out pizza. I thought sacrifice equaled value, that if I could just be useful enough, maybe my family would finally see me as someone worth keeping around. The harder I tried, I'd excitedly share something I'd accomplished, a promotion at work, a scholarship I'd applied for, a community project I'd helped organize in. The response was always the same: lukewarm acknowledgement followed by an immediate pivot to someone else's more impressive news. My Uncle Richard would say things like, "Well, that's good, Duda, but did you hear Jacob just got into law school?" As if my achievements only existed to be overshadowed. My Aunt Linda once told me, and I'll never forget this, that I was trying too hard and that real success comes naturally to people who have it in them, basically implying that my effort was proof I didn't have what it takes. They interpreted my dedication as desperation for lack of talent, and every attempt I made to prove otherwise just reinforced their belief that I was exactly what they thought I was. That dynamic created this toxic cycle where I'd push myself to the brink, get minimal or negative feedback, feel like a failure, and then push even harder, thinking maybe this time would be different. When I was 16, for months to buy my grandmother a really nice birthday present, this antique brooch I knew she'd been eyeing at the local estate sale, I wrapped it carefully, wrote her a heartfelt card about how much she meant to me even though deep down I was lying through my teeth, and presented it to her at her party in front of everyone. She opened it, barely glanced at it, and said, "Oh, how right," before setting it aside and gushing over the designer purse Emily had bought her with money from her trust fund. That moment gutted me in a way I still can't fully articulate. Wasn't about the gift, it was about the realization that no amount of effort, sacrifice, or love would ever be enough to earn her approval, because she'd fundamentally decided I wasn't worthy of it. And that realization, it followed me into adulthood, like a shadow I couldn't shake. Fast forward to my mid, which for someone like me felt like a massive achievement. I had a small apartment, a job as an administrative assistant at a local law firm, and a routine that kept me busy enough to avoid thinking too much about my family. When the invitation to Grandma Margaret's 80th birthday reunion arrived in the mail, my first instinct was to throw it straight in the trash and pretend I never received it, guilt-tripping me with the usual "it's family" Nora speech, and eventually I caved because saying no felt like admitting defeat, like letting them win by proving I was too weak to face them. Practiced my fake smile in the mirror, and drove 3 hours to the family estate convinced I could handle one evening of forced civility. Urged me, years of judgment settle on my shoulders like a lead blanket. Emily was there with her fiancé, a doctor she never stopped mentioning, showing off her engagement ring to anyone who'd look. Law school classmates had flown in from California with her newborn daughter, and watching Grandma Margaret cradle that baby with such tenderness made my chest ache in ways I didn't want to acknowledge. Nursed a glass of wine, made small talk with distant cousins who couldn't remember my name, for about an hour, that maybe everyone had matured enough to let old grudges die quietly, and Grandma Margaret stood up to give one of her infamous speeches, the kind where she'd go around the table acknowledging each grandchild's accomplishments with tears in her eyes and pride in her voice. She praised Emily for her upcoming wedding, Jacob for his law school acceptance, Claire for becoming a mother, each compliment more effusive than the last, each one accompanied by a story about how proud she was. Some stupid childish part of me hoping that maybe, just maybe, she'd find something kind to say, some acknowledgement that I existed and mattered. Instead, she paused directly at me with those cold blue eyes, and said in front of 37 relatives, and Nora, ... "Well, some people just aren't built for greatness, are they? You've never amounted to anything, and honestly, I don't think you ever will." It was deafening. Absolute. The kind of silence that makes you feel like you're suffocating in a room full of people who won't even meet your eyes. Unable to process what had just happened because part of me couldn't believe she'd actually said it out loud. This wasn't a private conversation, a whispered aside. This was a public execution, delivered with the same casual tone she'd used to comment on the weather. And I carefully set my fork down because I didn't trust myself to hold anything without dropping it. The worst part wasn't even the words themselves, yet was watching every single person at that table look away, study their plates, find sudden fascination with the wallpaper, anything to avoid acknowledging what they'd just witnessed. My Uncle Richard cleared his throat and changed the subject to golf. My Aunt Linda started asking Claire about the baby's sleep schedule, actually laughed a short, uncomfortable laugh that she tried to cover with a cough. But I heard it, and it cut deeper than my grandmother's words ever could. If you're still with me, hit that subscribe button because what I'm about to tell you gets even more intense. And drop a like if you can't believe someone would actually say that to their own grandchild. walked on legs that didn't quite feel like mine, and locked myself in a powder room that was bigger than my entire bedroom. Well apart, in real time. The tears came fast and ugly, the kind of crying that makes you hiccup and gasp for air. And I remember thinking this was it, this was the moment that would define the rest of my life. I could hear the muffled sounds of conversation and laughter continuing in the dining room, the party moving on without missing a beat. As if my devastation was just background noise nobody cared about. And that's when something inside me broke, or maybe it finally snapped into place. I couldn't tell the difference. When I finally composed myself enough to leave that bathroom, I didn't go back to the dining room. Go walk straight out the front door, and it stayed somewhere between rage and numbness, which told me everything I needed to know about where I stood in that family. That night became a turning point, not because of the humiliation itself, but because of what happened in the weeks and months that followed. Dissecting every word, every face, every person who chose silence over support, and I realized I'd been auditioning for a role in a family that had already cast me as the villain before. I even had lines to read. The question wasn't whether I could earn their love, it was even worth earning in the first place. Waking up after that family reunion felt like coming out of a violent storm. My mind was a mess. My body tense, and everything seemed a bit unreal, like I was moving underwater. I started to question everything. My value, my choices, even the memories I thought were solid, suddenly felt shaky, haunted by my grandmother's words. It wasn't just embarrassment. It was an avalanche of doubt that crashed through every part of my life. At work, I heard her voice in my head during meetings. With friends, I worried they'd see what she saw, someone destined to fail. I spent days replaying the dinner, dissecting every look, every laugh, every silence that cut just as deep as her words. Sleep didn't come easily. I would lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, trying to decide whether the pain would fade or if I'd just have to learn to live with it. Moments typing emails, grocery shopping, little reminders that I wasn't as strong as I'd hoped. The anxiety became a sort of companion, following me everywhere, whispering that I didn't belong, that I was just fooling myself trying to fit in. Sometimes, on especially hard days, I'd even doubt my own version of events, wondering if maybe I really was less, like she said, and that maybe I'd only ever imagined I could change my story. As exhausting as it was, that internal collapse cleared a kind of emotional ground zero. The pain forced me to face memories and patterns I'd been running from for years, especially those moments of feeling invisible or not enough. It was brutal and lonely, but it also made me examine what I actually wanted my life to look like, separate from what my family expected. Please subscribe, it helps remind me there are people out there who get it. And keep listening, because the next step I took changed everything I thought I knew about myself. At some point, a quiet but powerful realization began to grow. I'd been fighting for validation from people who had never even tried to understand me and likely never would. Was giving everything I had for scraps of affection was not just exhausting, it was pointless. One morning, after another night spent staring wide-eyed at the ceiling, I decided I'd had enough. That meant setting boundaries so firm they felt like walls. I stopped calling unless it was necessary, ignored most family group texts, and only showed up for major events out of respect for my mom. Not because I believed anything would be different. It wasn't easy. Cutting that emotional lifeline felt a lot like grief because, in a way, it was. I missed the idea of family, the hope that someday they'd see me for who I really was. Sometimes I'd almost text my cousin Claire, just to see if maybe we could talk honestly, but I'd stop myself, remembering all the times I'd reached out and gotten nothing back. My therapist told me that creating distance was an act of self-respect, but it didn't feel empowering at first, it felt like surrender. The space I created started to fill up with something new. A quiet freedom to define myself on my own terms. I learned that I could survive, and even thrive, outside the toxic orbit of constant judgment. Being on my own was scary, but it also forced me to develop new strengths. I didn't know I had resilience, patience, and a stubborn sense of self-worth. The ache of loneliness lingered, but it was cleaner now, less tangled with shame. For the first time, I started to believe that maybe, just maybe, my story didn't have to end the way my family expected. Voting for the most productive of my life now because I suddenly became successful, but because I finally stopped measuring my worth by their impossible standards. Online courses for project management and business administration, subjects I'd always been curious about but never pursued because they felt too ambitious for someone like me. Every evening after work, I'd sit at my tiny kitchen table with a cup of tea and dive into lectures, assignments, case studies, losing myself in the challenge of learning something new. There were no trophies or social media posts celebrating my progress, just quiet, consistent effort that slowly started to reshape how I saw myself. At work, I started speaking up in meetings, volunteering for projects I would have avoided before out of fear of failure or judgment. Linda Chen. noticed the change and pulled me aside one day to say she'd been impressed with my initiative. Simple words that hit me harder than they should have because I realized how starved I'd been for genuine recognition. Nothing earth-shattering, but it came with more responsibility, a modest salary increase, and most importantly, proof that someone saw value in me based on what I actually did, not who I was related to. And for the first time in years, I felt like I was building something real, something that belonged to me and no one else. The transformation wasn't instant or dramatic. There were still hard days when my grandmother's voice echoed in my head, moments of doubt when I questioned whether I was just fooling myself. But slowly, methodically, I started creating a life that felt authentic, one where my successes weren't compared to anyone else's and my failures didn't confirm some predetermined narrative about my worthlessness. I made new friends through my courses, people who knew nothing about my family drama and judged me solely on who I was in the present. If any of this resonates with you, please hit that subscribe button. Your support means everything. And trust me, what happens next in my story is something I never could have predicted, something that would finally give me the validation I'd spent a lifetime searching for. 3 years after that disastrous reunion, local area code, but not one saved in my contacts, 'cause I was in the middle of reviewing quarterly reports for work, but something made me pick up on the fourth ring. The voice on the other end was professional, measured, introducing himself as Martin Whitaker and Associates, and asking if I had a few minutes to discuss a sensitive matter regarding my family. Because in my experience, phone calls like that usually meant bad news. Someone had died, someone needed money they assumed I didn't have. He asked if I could come to his office the following day. Beyond saying it involved the estate of my great-uncle Harrison, a man I'd only met a handful of times at family gatherings when I was a kid. Harrison was my grandmother's older brother, a quiet, eccentric guy who'd made his fortune in commercial real estate and then basically disappeared from family events. About 15 years ago, after some unspecified falling out with Margaret, I remembered him as kind, always slipping me an extra piece of candy when no one was looking, asking genuine questions about school, and actually listening to my answers, but we'd never been close, and I hadn't even known he'd passed away until that moment. I sat in Martin Whitaker's wood-paneled office, hands folded in my lap, trying to prepare myself for whatever was coming. Maybe Harrison had left small amounts to all the grandkids and great-nieces and great-nephews. Maybe I'd get a few $1,000s, enough to finally replace my dying car, or put toward a vacation I'd never take. The attorney opened a leather folder, adjusted his glasses, and said something that made time stop. "Mr. User Harrison Blackwell has named you as a sole beneficiary of a substantial portion of his estate, valued at approximately $847,000, along with a personal letter he wrote specifically for you." The words hung in the air like smoke, and I actually asked him to repeat it because I was convinced I'd misheard, that this was some kind of administrative error, that any second he'd realize he'd called the wrong Nora Hayes. He was no mistake. Harrison had been very specific in his will, updated just 6 months before his death, and my name was the only one listed for this particular inheritance. He slid the envelope across his desk, cream-colored paper with my name written in shaky handwriting that could barely grip the paper, written in Harrison's distinctive script, and the first line made my eyes blur with tears. "Dear Nora, if you're reading this, it means I've finally escaped this world, and I hope I've left it a little better by giving you what you've always deserved." He went on to explain that he'd watched me grow up from a distance, noticed how the family treated me, and saw something in me that reminded him of himself, someone who didn't fit the mold Margaret had created, someone who was overlooked and underestimated simply for being different. Harrison wrote that he distanced himself from the family because he couldn't stomach watching my grandmother destroy people with her cruelty, particularly children who had no way to defend themselves. He mentioned specific moments I'd completely forgotten: the Christmas I got elaborate gifts, the spelling bee achievement that went unacknowledged, even that brooch incident when I was 16, which he'd witnessed and which had apparently disgusted him so much he stopped attending family events altogether. "You had dignity even when they tried to strip it from you," he wrote, "and that kind of strength is rare and precious." Was an investment in someone he believed in, brilliance and character in circumstances that would have broken most people. The final paragraph of his letter shattered me in the best possible way. "I'm sorry I didn't do more when you needed it most, but I hope this inheritance gives you the freedom to build the life you deserve, without needing anyone's permission or approval. You were always enough, Nora. Even if they didn't, use this to prove them wrong, not because they deserve your effort, but because you deserve your own freedom." I sat in that attorney's office and cried not the desperate, humiliated tears from the reunion, but something deeper, cleaner, like a wound finally being cleaned after years of infection. Martin discreetly handed me tissues and gave me time to compose myself, and when I finally looked up, he smiled gently and said, "He talked about you often, you know." Walking out of that office felt surreal, like I'd stepped into someone else's life, someone luckier, someone valued, someone who mattered. The money itself was staggering, more than I'd earn in a decade at my current job. But what hit me even harder was the recognition, the validation from someone who'd seen me clearly and chosen to believe in me anyway. Someone had looked at my worth and decided I deserved investment. Not because of what I could do for them, but simply because I existed and had value. That realization broke something open inside me, years of accumulated pain. Doubt and shame started to crack and fall away like old plaster, revealing something solid underneath. Harrison's letter clutched in my passenger seat like a sacred text, and I must have read it 50 times over the next few days, searching for proof that it was real, that someone had truly seen me. The grief hit me hard, to mourning a relationship I'd never fully had with Harrison, wishing I'd reached out to him before it was too late, wishing I'd known he was watching and caring from a distance. But mixed with that grief was something I'd rarely felt, gratitude so profound it physically hurt. The kind that makes you want to fall to your knees and thank the universe for finally giving you a break. I cried a lot during those first weeks, not sad tears, but the kind that come when pressure you've been carrying for decades suddenly lifts and you can finally breathe. Wasn't just about financial security, though that mattered, especially for someone who'd spent years living paycheck to paycheck, always one emergency away from disaster. It was about emotional justice, about the universe acknowledging that I'd been wronged and offering some kind of cosmic correction. For years, I'd internalized my family's assessment of me, believed on some level that maybe I really was less capable, less deserving, less everything. His deliberate choice to leave me that money was evidence that their narrative was a lie, that at least one person had seen the truth. And if he could finally start believing it too. News travels fast in family, especially when money's involved, and it took less than a week for word of my inheritance to spread through the family network like wildfire, lighting up with texts and calls from relatives, cousins suddenly interested in catching up. Even my Uncle Richard, who'd never once acknowledged my existence outside of obligatory holiday greetings. The transparency was almost funny, the way they'd open with some weak pleasantries, before circling around to, "So, I heard about Uncle Harrison's will." With that careful tone people use when they're fishing for information they think they're entitled to. I let most of the calls go to voicemail, reading the transcripts later with a detached amusement I'd never felt before, watching people scramble for crumbs of the fortune they'd spent years telling me I'd never deserve. Emily was the first to actually confront me directly, showing up at my apartment unannounced with a bottle of wine and a smile so fake it could have been plastic, making small talk about her wedding plans, her new house, her perfect life, before finally getting to the point. "It's just so surprising that Harrison left everything to you, you know? I mean, we were all family, and it seems a bit unfair that he didn't split it equally." There it was, the entitlement, the assumption that my inheritance was somehow stolen from them, that I didn't deserve what I'd been given. This woman who'd laughed when our grandmother humiliated me, and felt absolutely nothing, no anger, no hurt, just a cold clarity that told me exactly who she was and always had been. The most audacious move came from my grandmother herself, who had my mother call to arrange a family meeting to discuss Harrison's estate and make sure everyone was treated fairly. The woman who'd publicly declared I'd never amount to anything now wanted to sit down and negotiate my inheritance like it was community property. I declined, politely but firmly, and told my mom I wouldn't be participating in any discussions about money that Harrison had specifically, intentionally left to me. That's when the attack started. Whispered comments about me being selfish, greedy, ungrateful for turning my back on family in their time of need. The irony would have been hilarious if it wasn't so predictable. The same people who'd spent decades making me feel worthless now wanted a piece of the validation someone else had given me. I want to be clear about something. The inheritance changed my financial situation dramatically, but the real transformation had already started long before that money ever touched my account. Or the work I'd done in those 3 years of distance building skills, establishing boundaries, learning to value myself independent of their approval. That was the foundation everything else was built on. Harrison's gift didn't create my worth. It confirmed something I'd been slowly, painfully learning to believe, that I had always been enough, that the problem was never me but a toxic system designed to keep me small. Liberation that came from finally, definitively knowing I'd been right to walk away. I used part of the inheritance to start my own consulting business, something I dreamed about but never had the confidence or capital to pursue. Owning a therapist who specialized in family trauma and spent a year unpacking the damage, learning to separate my identity from their narratives, building new neural pathways that didn't automatically default to shame and self-doubt. I traveled to places I'd only seen in magazines, not because I needed to prove anything, but because I finally believed I deserved to take up space in the world. And slowly, gradually, I built a life that looked nothing like what my family predicted, not out of spite. Though I won't lie and say that wasn't satisfying, but because I'd finally given myself permission to want more and believe I could have it. The relationship with my family never recovered. And honestly, I stopped trying to repair it because I realized it had never been whole to begin with. I maintain cordial distance with my mom and brother, send cards on birthdays, when absolutely necessary, but the desperate need for their acceptance, that aching wound that defined my first 28 years, has finally healed over. Sometimes I think about my grandmother and wonder if she ever regretted her cruelty, if she ever recognized the role she played in pushing me away. But mostly I don't think about her at all, and that indifference feels like the sweetest revenge, not because I hurt her, but because she no longer has the power to hurt me. The girl who sat at that dinner table, shaking and humiliated, wouldn't recognize the woman I've become, and that's exactly how it should be. So here's what I want you to take away from my story. Your worth is not determined by the people who refuse to see it. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stop performing for an audience that's already decided you're not worth watching. Where family, friends, or anyone else is making you feel less than, smaller than, not enough, I need you to hear this. They're wrong, and their inability to recognize your value says everything about them and nothing about you. It took me 28 years and an inheritance from a relative I barely knew to fully internalize that lesson. But I'm hoping by sharing this, maybe you can get there faster, with less pain, and without needing external validation to believe it. Watching this or going through something similar, trapped in family dynamics that diminish you, questioning whether you're the problem, wondering if maybe they're right about your limitations. Please hear me when I say, you are not crazy, you are not broken, and you are not obligated to keep showing up for people who consistently hurt you. Setting boundaries isn't selfish, walking away isn't failure, choosing yourself isn't betrayal. The inheritance gave me financial freedom, yes, but the real freedom came from deciding I was worth fighting for, even when no one else would. And you are worth fighting for too right now, exactly as you are, no conditions attached. If you saw pieces of your own life reflected in mine, do me a favor, hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and drop a comment telling me what you'd do in my position. Would you have confronted your family directly, or was distance the right call? And make sure you're subscribed with notifications turned on, because next week I'm sharing a follow-up about what happened when my grandmother tried one last time to manipulate me. And trust me, you're not going to want to miss how that conversation ended. Until then, remember, you were always enough, even when they couldn't see it. I'll see you in the next video.